Welcome to solverfy.
Okay, we're showing the following groups. And we are asked if they are presented in order of decreasing priority following the Kahn-Ingold-Prelog rules. Add all the hydrogens in here. And I'll add one hydrogen here. I guess I can add them all. Okay, so are these indeed in order of decreasing priority, highest first and lowest last? Well, I think the easiest way to go about this is to just determine what the priority of these various groups is, right? So remember, the first thing that we do is say, okay, what atom is connected? Carbon. Okay, what atom is connected in this case directly? Carbon. Carbon and carbon. So at this point, each of them is tied. What do we do when we catch a tie? We look to see what those atoms are connected to. And specifically, we will make a list of every atom that the tied atoms are connected to in order from highest priority to lowest. So, for example, with this carbon right here, it's connected to a carbon, and a carbon. That's right. For triple bonds, we count the connection 3 times, double bonds twice. So then I like to write that down next to the tied atom. I say carbon, carbon, carbon. Okay, now we'll look at our next structure. I see carbon, hydrogen, carbon. So in order of priority, that's carbon, carbon, hydrogen. Okay, for our next, we see carbon, carbon, hydrogen. And finally, we have hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. Okay, so clearly we can see, and then the next thing we do is compare the highest priority group from each of the new lists we've created. We say carbon versus carbon versus carbon versus hydrogen. Hydrogen is a loser, so we know that this is the lowest priority. So we're going to call this 4 for the lowest. But now we've still got this problem where we've got a tie, right? We looked at those, so we move to the next one. Okay, now we've got carbon versus carbon versus carbon. Everyone's still tied. So we'll cross these off and look to the next one. Now we've got carbon versus hydrogen versus hydrogen. Okay, we have a clear winner. Carbon beats hydrogen and hydrogen. Okay. So now this is number 1. Okay, now these two are still tied, right? They were hydrogen and hydrogen. So what we have to do is start going down any available chains. Okay, so in the case of the first one, we'll go down here. And then we'll say, okay, we've got all the atoms that are attached to this carbon, right? So they're kind of branching off of here. And what we've got then is hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. All right, then we're going to follow this, which is representative of this carbon. And that's hydrogen, 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 right? And then we would go to this hydrogen, which doesn't have any bonds. So this is just kind of like an empty set. There's nothing there. Okay, now we'll do the same for this carbon. We're going to go to the next carbon. And what's it attached to? Hydrogen, hydrogen. And we do not count backwards. So, we do count backwards, but only once. Sorry. No, we do not count backwards. Okay, so what we do is we count backwards a single time, right? So from this carbon, we say we're bound to carbon and hydrogen and hydrogen. That's coming from here. Carbon, because we go backwards, but only once, then hydrogen, And then when we count this second carbon, which is from the double bond from our original red circled carbon, this counts as being bound to nothing. So that's like X, 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 right? And then we could branch to our hydrogen, but that's also got nothing, right? So we would compare then the highest priority group from each of these branching paths, in our case carbon, versus the highest priority from the isopropyl side, which is hydrogen. And in the end, vinyl ends up winning. In this case, this is a vinyl group, right? So we get that in terms of priority, this is number 2 and this is number 3, right? And if you want to see that again, I'll do it afterwards, but the final answer is false, right? And that's because this group is higher priority than this. And let's explore that one more time. So draw it out a little better. Okay, versus the vinyl. And we'll go through the process once again. Okay, so first of all, we look at what I'll call the red carbon, and those are tied. Yes, carbon, carbon, that's a tie. So carbon, carbon, result is a tie. Okay, so now we look at what they are attached to. So in the case of the red carbon on the isopropyl, we've got carbon, carbon, and hydrogen. So we've got carbon, carbon, and hydrogen. And on the right-hand side, we've got carbon, carbon again for the double bond, and hydrogen. Carbon, carbon, and hydrogen. Okay, at this point, they are still tied. So now we see what the patterns are from the atoms that we jumped to, right, in the last one. So we'll go from blue carbon to hydrogen, hydrogen, and hydrogen. That's coming from here, hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. And from here, this blue carbon, we go hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. Okay, and then this hydrogen does not branch, right? There's nothing else attached to the hydrogen except for the single bond backwards. So this is just nothing. I'll put a 0. Okay, now on to our so-called vinyl group. Sorry, I forgot to fill these in blue last time. Okay, so we would start from this carbon, and we would say it's attached to, and we can count one of these double bonds back, but only one. So we go carbon, okay, and then hydrogen, and then hydrogen. So this would get like highlighted in green again, and it comes from here, carbon, hydrogen, hydrogen. Now this carbon, which was from the double bond going from the red carbon to the blue carbon, does not get to count backwards because it was sort of a virtual or like made up carbon based on the double bond. So we wouldn't actually count that. Okay, so this would be counted as a 0. And finally, hydrogen would also be counted as a 0. And so because at each step we only compare the highest priority atom in our list, which in this case is carbon, versus highest priority over here is hydrogen, we actually end up with the so-called vinyl group winning. So this is a higher priority. Vinyl is higher priority than isopropyl. Higher priority than isopropyl.